Every year, millions of tourists walk the cobblestone streets of Colonial Williamsburg, Virginia, marveling at perfectly preserved 18th century buildings. But in 2005, when 28-year-old museum curator Sarah Mitchell discovered a forgotten diary in the archives, one that revealed a modern crime hidden within colonial records, she became the only person who knew the truth. Within 48 hours, she was gone. For 18 years, her disappearance remained a mystery, until a retired detective's deathbed confession in 2023 revealed that Sarah hadn't uncovered history at all. She'd uncovered murder. And the killer had been giving tours to tourists every single day since. Before diving into the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell to stay updated on the latest cases. Colonial Williamsburg, Virginia. March 2005. The historic district glowed under the soft spring sun, its brick facades and white-painted colonial homes standing as proud monuments to America's revolutionary past. Tour guides in period costumes led groups of fascinated visitors down Duke of Gloucester Street, their voices carrying tales of founding fathers and colonial courage. The air smelled of boxwood hedges and freshly baked bread from the historic bakery, where demonstrators recreated 18th-century baking techniques for delighted audiences. Children ran across the palace green while their parents photographed the governor's palace, its imposing Georgian architecture casting long shadows across manicured gardens. In this carefully preserved world, Sarah Mitchell felt most at home. A Virginia native with sandy blonde hair often pulled back in a practical ponytail, Sarah had dedicated her entire adult life to preserving the past. She'd grown up just 30 miles away in Richmond, spending childhood weekends exploring historic sites with her grandmother, a retired history professor who instilled in her a reverence for primary sources and authentic narratives. After earning her master's degree in colonial American history from the College of William and Mary, Sarah had landed her dream position as assistant curator at the DeWitt Wallace Decorative Arts Museum, part of the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. Her colleagues described her as meticulous, almost obsessive about detail. She could spend hours examining a single artifact, cross-referencing provenance documents, authentication records, and historical inventories. Her small office in the museum's administrative wing overflowed with research materials, leather-bound catalogs, acid-free folders containing fragile documents, and dozens of yellow legal pads covered in her neat, precise handwriting. Sarah lived alone in a modest apartment in the nearby town of Toano, a 15-minute drive from the historic district. Her life was simple, structured, predictable. She arrived at work each morning at 7:30, left at 5:15, and spent most evenings reading academic journals or working on her long-term research project documenting the lives of enslaved craftspeople in colonial Virginia. On the morning of March 14, 2005, Sarah arrived at work earlier than usual. She'd received permission to access a restricted section of the archives, a climate-controlled vault in the museum's basement that housed the most sensitive historical documents. She was researching land transfer records from the 1760s, trying to trace ownership patterns of properties that had belonged to wealthy colonial families. The project was personal as much as professional. Sarah believed that understanding who owned what land and how they acquired it could reveal uncomfortable truths about the economic foundations of colonial Virginia society. The vault was silent except for the gentle hum of dehumidifiers. Fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow over rows of metal shelving units, each packed with archival boxes labeled with faded typewritten cards. Sarah moved systematically through the collection, pulling boxes according to her research list, photographing documents with her digital camera, and making careful notes. By mid-morning, she'd worked through 7 boxes of 18th-century property deeds and court records. Then she found the diary. It wasn't supposed to be there. The box was labeled Randolph Family Correspondence, 1755 to 1770, but when Sarah opened it, she discovered it had been misfiled. Inside, beneath layers of acid-free tissue paper, lay a small leather-bound journal. The cover was unmarked, the leather worn smooth by handling. Sarah carefully opened it, expecting more colonial-era documents. Instead, the first page bore a date that made her freeze, January 15, 1987. The handwriting was modern, written in blue ballpoint pen. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she turned the pages. The entries were sporadic, sometimes weeks apart, written by someone who seemed to be recording something they feared would be forgotten or deliberately erased. The author never identified themselves directly, but the content was devastating. They described watching someone they called R.H. Later entries revealed this to be Robert Hammond, the longtime director of museum operations, systematically stealing artifacts from the Colonial Williamsburg collection. The diary detailed specific incidents. A set of 18th-century silver candlesticks that disappeared from storage in February 1987, only to be replaced with convincing reproductions. A rare map of Virginia from 1775 that was supposedly sent out for conservation but never returned, with paperwork falsified to indicate it had been lost in transit. The author described confronting Hammond about discrepancies in inventory records, and Hammond's cold response, a threat veiled as friendly advice to not dig where the foundation might be unstable. But the diary entries that made Sarah's blood run cold weren't about theft. They were about a person. In an entry dated March 3, 1987, the author wrote about a junior curator named Michael Torres who had discovered Hammond's scheme. Torres had threatened to report Hammond to the Foundation's board. 3 days later, another entry, Michael didn't come to work today. Robert said he quit without notice, moved back to California. But Michael's car is still in the employee lot. I walked by it during lunch. His briefcase is on the back seat. The final entry was dated March 9, 1987. I'm writing this down because I'm afraid. Robert knows that I know. He's watching me. I'm going to hide this journal in the archives where he won't think to look, then I'm going to the police tomorrow. If something happens to me, someone needs to know the truth. Michael Torres didn't quit. Robert did something to him. And the artifacts aren't just being stolen, they are being sold to a private collector. I saw the receipt. $500,000. This isn't about history. It's about greed. And I think Robert would kill to protect it. There were no more entries after that date. Sarah sat in the cold vault for a long time, the diary open in her lap. She thought about Michael Torres, the junior curator who supposedly quit in 1987. She thought about the diary's author, who had written with such fear in those final lines. She carefully photographed every page with her digital camera, then returned the diary to its box. Her mind raced with questions. Who had written this? What had happened to them? Had they gone to the police? And most urgently, was Robert Hammond, now the deputy director of the entire Colonial Williamsburg Foundation and one of the most respected figures in the American museum community, really a thief and possibly a murderer? Sarah knew she couldn't ignore what she'd found. But she also knew she needed to be careful. If the diary's accusations were true, Hammond was dangerous. She decided to do some preliminary research on her own before taking the diary to authorities. She would verify that Michael Torres had actually worked at Colonial Williamsburg. She would look into any missing artifacts from that time period. She would try to identify who might have written the diary by cross-referencing staff records from 1987. She finished her work in the vault, carefully reshelved all the boxes except the one containing the diary, which she kept out, planning to return to it after lunch. She locked the vault and went upstairs to her office. It was just afternoon. The museum was busy with visitors, their voices echoing through the galleries. Sarah sat at her desk and opened her computer, pulling up the Foundation's employee database. She typed in Michael Torres and hit search. Nothing came up. No employment records at all. She tried variations of the name. Still nothing. It was as if Michael Torres had never existed in the Foundation's official records. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She pulled out her phone and searched online for Michael Torres Curator Virginia 1987. A few results appeared, but none seemed relevant. Then she tried Michael Torres Missing California 1987. The third result made her breath catch. A brief news article from the San Diego Union Tribune, dated April 1987, Family of Missing Museum Professional Seeks Information. The article described Michael Torres, 29, a museum curator who had moved to Virginia for work in 1986. His family reported him missing after he failed to return home for a planned visit in March 1987. His car had been found abandoned in Williamsburg, but there were no signs of foul play. The case had gone cold. Sarah's hands shook as she printed the article. This was real. Michael Torres had disappeared. And according to the diary, Robert Hammond was responsible. She needed to tell someone, but who? Hammond was deputy director. He had authority over nearly everyone at the foundation. If she went to the wrong person, if word got back to Hammond before she had enough proof, she could be in danger. She decided to call her former thesis advisor, Dr. Eleanor Vance, a retired professor who had spent 40 years teaching at William and Mary. Dr. Vance had connections throughout Virginia's historical community and, more importantly, she had never been afraid to challenge institutional power when she believed injustice was being done. Sarah picked up her office phone and dialed. Dr. Vance answered on the third ring. Sarah explained what she'd found, speaking quietly even though her office door was closed. Dr. Vance listened without interrupting, then spoke in the careful, measured tone she'd used when advising doctoral students through difficult research challenges. Sarah, this is serious. If what you're saying is accurate, you've uncovered evidence of both theft and possible homicide. You need to go to the police immediately. Don't wait. Don't try to investigate further on your own. But I don't have enough proof yet, Sarah argued. It's just a diary. An anonymous diary. Hammond could claim it's fabricated, that someone planted it to discredit him. Then let the police determine that, Dr. Vance said firmly. You're not a detective, Sarah. You're a curator who's stumbled onto something dangerous. Promise me you'll call the Williamsburg Police Department today. Sarah promised. They spoke for a few more minutes, with Dr. Vance making Sarah repeat the promise twice more before hanging up. Sarah sat at her desk, staring at the printed article about Michael Torres. She knew Dr. Vance was right. She should call the police immediately. But a part of her, the meticulous researcher who had spent years learning to verify sources and authenticate documents, wanted to be absolutely certain before making an accusation that could destroy a man's reputation and career. She decided to make one more check. The diary had mentioned a receipt for $500,000, a sale to a private collector. If she could find any evidence of unusual financial activity connected to Hammond in 1987, that would strengthen the case. She knew that personnel files were kept in the administration building, in locked cabinets in the HR director's office. Sarah had a key to that building, most senior staff did, but she didn't have access to the locked cabinets themselves. Unless she could find a reason to be in that office when no one else was there. It was 2:15. The HR director, Patricia Chen, always took a late lunch from 2:30 to 3:30, using the time to walk the historic district for exercise. Sarah had seen her doing this countless times. She could wait until Patricia left, let herself into the administration building with her key, and look through the files. She wouldn't take anything, just photograph whatever she found. It would take 10 minutes, maybe less. The decision made, Sarah waited in her office, watching the clock. At 2:35, she saw Patricia walk past her window, heading toward Duke of Gloucester Street in her walking shoes and sunglasses. Sarah grabbed her museum keycard, her phone, and a notebook. She walked quickly to the administration building, a modest brick structure tucked behind the main museum, used primarily for Foundation business offices. The building was quiet. Most administrative staff took early lunches, and by mid-afternoon, the offices were often empty, with people out at meetings or working from home. Sarah climbed the stairs to the second floor where HR was located. She tried the door to Patricia's office. Unlocked. She stepped inside, closing the door quietly behind her. The office was neat, organized, everything in its place. A row of 4-drawer filing cabinets lined one wall. Sarah moved to them quickly, trying each drawer. The first 3 cabinets were unlocked, containing current employee files, benefits information, training records. The 4th cabinet had a small lock on the top drawer. Sarah pulled gently. Locked. She stood there, frustrated, knowing she shouldn't be doing this but unable to let go of the nagging need to verify the diary's claims. Then she noticed a key ring hanging on a small hook inside Patricia's desk drawer, which she'd left open while searching for something to write with. One key looked like it might fit the filing cabinet. Sarah's hands were sweating now. She was definitely crossing a line. But she took the key and tried it in the lock. It turned smoothly. The drawer slid open, revealing files labeled with years rather than names. These were archived personnel files, old records from staff who no longer worked at the foundation. Sarah flipped through them, looking for 1987. She found a thick folder labeled 1987 Separations. Inside were exit interview forms, resignation letters, termination paperwork for employees who had left the foundation that year. She flipped through quickly, looking for anything related to Michael Torres or the mysterious diary author. Most of the names meant nothing to her. Then she saw a resignation letter dated March 10, 1987, signed by someone named Jennifer Caldwell, with archival assistant listed as her position. The letter was brief, formal, giving 2 weeks' notice with the standard language about appreciating the opportunity and pursuing other interests. But something about the date struck Sarah. March 10, just one day after the final diary entry, which had been written on March 9. Could Jennifer Caldwell have been the diary's author? Sarah photographed the letter with her phone, then kept searching through the file. Near the back, she found Michael Torres's file. It was thin, containing only his original application materials and a single sheet of paper, a handwritten note on foundation letterhead, dated March 6, 1987, from Robert Hammond to the HR director at that time. The note read, "Please process termination for Michael Torres, effective immediately. Employee abandoned position, left state without notice. No forwarding address provided. Close file and archive." There was no exit interview. No resignation letter from Torres himself. Just Hammond's note, claiming Torres had abandoned his job. Sarah photographed this too, her heart pounding. This was it. This was evidence that something had been wrong with Torres's departure. People didn't just abandon professional positions at prestigious institutions without a word. And they certainly didn't leave their cars in the employee parking lot when they left the state. Sarah was so focused on photographing the documents that she didn't hear the office door open behind her. She didn't hear the footsteps crossing the carpet. She only realized she wasn't alone when a familiar voice spoke from directly behind her, making her jump and nearly drop her phone. "Sarah, I'm surprised to see you here." She spun around. Robert Hammond stood in the doorway, his tall frame blocking the exit. He was 63 years old, silver-haired, distinguished-looking in the way that men in positions of academic authority often were. He wore pressed khakis and a blue Oxford shirt, reading glasses hanging from a cord around his neck. His expression was calm, almost gentle, but something in his eyes made Sarah's stomach clench with fear. "Dr. Hammond," she managed, trying to keep her voice steady. Patricia asked me to look for something in the old files." "Did she?" Hammond stepped into the office, closing the door behind him. "That's interesting, because I just spoke with Patricia downstairs. She didn't mention asking you for any help. And she seemed quite surprised when I told her you were up here in her office." Sarah's mind raced. She still held her phone, the screen showing the photo she'd just taken of Hammond's 1987 note about Michael Torres. Hammond's gaze dropped to the phone, then to the open filing cabinet, then back to Sarah's face. She watched his expression change, saw the exact moment when he understood what she'd been doing. "You found it," he said quietly. "It wasn't a question. The diary. I've looked for it for 36 years. Where was it?" Sarah's mouth was dry. She backed up a step, but there was nowhere to go. The office was small, Hammond blocking the only exit. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, but her voice shook, betraying her. Hammond sighed, a sound of tired resignation. "Please don't insult both of us by lying, Sarah. You're a smart woman. Too smart for your own good, apparently, just like Jennifer was. That's why you're up here looking through files from 1987, isn't it? Because you found Jennifer's diary and you're trying to verify what she wrote." The confirmation hit Sarah like a physical blow. He was admitting it. Not directly, but the implication was clear. He knew about the diary. He knew Jennifer had written it. And his use of the past tense when talking about Jennifer, just like Jennifer was, suggested she was no longer alive. "Where is she?" Sarah asked, finding her courage. "Where's Jennifer Caldwell?" Hammond moved further into the office, his movements casual, unhurried. "Jennifer made the same mistake you're making right now. She thought she could be a hero. Thought she could expose me, bring me down, Get justice for poor Michael Torres. She didn't understand that sometimes the only thing that matters is survival. Not justice, not truth, not doing the right thing. Just survival. You killed them, Sarah whispered. You killed Michael Torres because he found out you were stealing from the foundation. And you killed Jennifer Caldwell because she tried to stop you. Hammond's expression didn't change. He looked at her with something like pity. Michael was impulsive. He came to me with accusations, threatening to ruin my career over a few missing artifacts. He didn't understand the financial pressures I was under. My wife's medical bills, my daughter's college tuition. I wasn't stealing for greed, Sarah. I was trying to keep my family from losing everything. Michael wouldn't listen to reason. He was going to the board the next morning. So I met with him that evening to talk, supposedly to convince him to give me time to fix the situation. We met in the basement of the Peyton Randolph house, after it closed to visitors. And things got out of hand. Sarah's legs felt weak. She was listening to a confession of murder, spoken in the same calm tone Hammond used when giving lectures to visiting scholars. And Jennifer, she managed to ask. Jennifer was collateral damage, Hammond said with genuine regret. She worked in the archives. She processed the paperwork when Michael's position was eliminated from the records. She got suspicious, started asking questions. I tried to warn her off, but she persisted. The night she planned to go to the police, I intercepted her in the parking lot after work. Another conversation that got out of hand. Sarah's hand tightened around her phone. She needed to get out of this office, needed to get help, but Hammond stood between her and the door, and despite his age, he was taller and stronger than she was. People know I'm here, she said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. If something happens to me, they'll know. Who will know? Hammond interrupted gently. Your colleagues saw you leave your office over an hour ago. The security cameras will show you entering this building alone, accessing offices you had no business being in, going through confidential files. If you disappear, Sarah, the narrative writes itself. You were caught doing something improper, panicked, and ran. Maybe you'll turn up in a few months, maybe you won't. Either way, by the time anyone seriously looks for you, I'll have had plenty of time to stage whatever scenario is necessary. The casual way he discussed it, as if he'd done this calculus before, made Sarah realize she was in immediate danger. She looked at the window, but they were on the second floor, and the windows were the old colonial style with small panes, not big enough to climb through even if she could break the glass. Her phone was still in her hand. If she could just. Hammond must have seen her intention. He moved faster than she expected, crossing the space between them in 2 strides and grabbing her wrist. The phone fell to the carpet. Hammond bent to pick it up, maintaining his grip on Sarah's arm. He scrolled through her recent photos with his free hand, his jaw tightening as he saw the images of the diary pages, the Torres file, his own 1987 note. Thorough, he said with bitter admiration. Just like Jennifer. She photographed everything too. Thought that would protect her, that somehow if she documented it all, I wouldn't dare hurt her. But you can delete digital photos, Sarah. You can wipe phones. And once the evidence is gone, there's nothing but hearsay and speculation. He pulled her toward the door, his grip firm but not painful, maintaining the appearance of normalcy in case anyone happened to see them in the hallway. Sarah tried to pull away, but his fingers tightened. Don't make a scene, he said quietly. All I want is for you to show me where you found the diary. Then we're going to have a reasonable conversation about how this situation can be resolved without anyone getting hurt. Do you understand? Sarah understood perfectly. He was taking her back to the museum vault, to the isolated basement where no one would hear her scream, just like he'd taken Michael Torres to an isolated basement in 1987. Her mind raced. She needed to do something, needed to alert someone. As Hammond opened the office door and pulled her into the hallway, she made her decision. She screamed. The sound echoed through the quiet building, high and terrified. Hammond's grip tightened painfully, but Sarah kept screaming, fighting against his hold. Doors opened along the hallway. Patricia Chen appeared at the top of the stairs, returning early from her walk. A maintenance worker emerged from a supply closet. Both stared in shock at the scene, the distinguished deputy director gripping the wrist of a young curator who was clearly trying to get away from him. "She's hysterical," Hammond said smoothly, not letting go. "I found her going through confidential files. When I confronted her, she became agitated." "He killed them!" Sarah shouted, not caring how insane it sounded. "Michael Torres and Jennifer Caldwell, he admitted it. He's going to kill me too." The accusation hung in the air. Patricia's face showed complete confusion. The maintenance worker looked uncertain whether to intervene. Hammond's expression remained calm, but Sarah felt his hand trembling slightly, the only sign of stress. "She's clearly having some kind of breakdown," he said to the others. "Sarah, please, calm down. Let's go somewhere private and talk about this." "No." Sarah wrenched her arm hard, finally breaking free from his grip. She stumbled backward, nearly falling. "Don't let him take me anywhere alone. Please. Call the police. He confessed to killing 2 people. Patricia pulled out her cell phone, but her expression suggested she thought Sarah was the problem, not Hammond. "I'm calling security," she said. "Robert, what's going on?" Before Hammond could answer, Sarah ran. She bolted past Patricia, down the stairs, her footsteps thundering on the old wooden steps. Behind her, she heard Hammond calling after her, his voice still controlled, still reasonable. "Sarah, wait. Let's talk about this." She burst through the front door of the administration building into the bright afternoon sunlight. Tourists walked past on the brick sidewalks, completely unaware of the drama unfolding. Sarah ran toward the main museum building, her breath coming in gasps. She needed to get to the diary, needed to secure it before Hammond could. It was the only physical evidence that any of this was real. She swiped her key card at the employee entrance to the museum and ran down the back stairs to the basement level where the vault was located. Her hands shook as she entered the combination on the vault's lock. The heavy door swung open. The climate-controlled air hit her face as she rushed to the shelving unit where she'd left the box containing the diary. The box was gone. Sarah stared at the empty space, not understanding at first. She'd left it right here, 4th shelf, 3 rows back. But now there was nothing but empty air. She frantically searched the surrounding shelves, thinking maybe she'd misremembered the location. But the box labeled Randolph Family Correspondence, 1755 to 1770 was nowhere to be seen. "Looking for this?" Hammond's voice came from the vault entrance. Sarah spun around. He stood in the doorway, holding the archival box. His calm facade had cracked. His face was flushed, his breathing heavy from running. But his eyes were cold now, calculating. "I took the liberty of retrieving it while you were making your dramatic scene upstairs," he said. "I know this vault's combination. I know every vault, every lock, every secure space in this entire institution. Did you really think you could hide evidence from me in my own building?" Sarah backed up until she hit the metal shelving behind her. There was no other exit from the vault. Hammond stood between her and the only door, just as he had in Patricia's office. But this time, they were in a soundproof basement vault where no one would hear her scream. Hammond set the box down on the small table near the vault entrance. "I want you to know I don't enjoy this," he said, his voice heavy with what sounded like genuine regret. "You're a talented curator, Sarah. You have a brilliant career ahead of you. It's a waste, it really is. But you've left me no choice." He moved toward her, and Sarah grabbed the nearest object she could reach, a heavy archival box from the shelf beside her. She threw it at him with all her strength. The box struck his shoulder, breaking open and sending 18th-century documents flying through the climate-controlled air like snow. Hammond stumbled back, more from surprise than injury. Sarah didn't wait. She rushed past him, shoving hard as she went. She heard him curse, heard his footsteps behind her, but she was younger and faster. She burst out of the vault into the basement hallway and ran for the stairs. If she could just get to the main floor, get to where there were people, witnesses. Her foot caught on something, her own shoe, untied and loose from running. She fell hard, her palms hitting the concrete floor, pain shooting up her wrists. Before she could get up, Hammond was on her. His weight pressed her down, his hand covering her mouth when she tried to scream. "Stop fighting," he hissed in her ear. "You'll only make it worse." But Sarah kept fighting. She bit down on his palm, tasted blood, heard him yelp in pain and momentarily loosen his grip. She rolled away and crawled toward the stairs, her mind blank with terror, operating on pure survival instinct. She could see the stairwell door, could see light from the floor above. The blow came from behind, something hard striking the back of her head. The world tilted, went fuzzy at the edges. Sarah heard herself make a sound, a whimper of pain and fear. Then Hammond was dragging her backward, away from the stairs, back toward the vault. She tried to resist, but her body wouldn't respond properly. Everything felt distant, dreamlike. "I'm sorry," she heard Hammond saying, his voice coming from very far away. "I'm so sorry, but you forced my hand. Just like Jennifer did. Just like Michael did. None of you could just leave well enough alone." Sarah's vision was blurring. She felt herself being pulled across the floor, felt the cold air of the vault as Hammond dragged her inside. She tried to speak, to call for help, but only a weak sound came out. The last thing she saw before unconsciousness took her was the scattered 18th century documents on the vault floor, irreplaceable pieces of history she'd inadvertently destroyed in her fight for survival. Then everything went black. When Sarah opened her eyes, she couldn't immediately understand where she was. The darkness was absolute, so complete that she couldn't see her own hand in front of her face. The air was cold and dry, with that distinctive recycled quality that suggested a controlled environment. As her senses slowly returned, she became aware of several things at once. Her head throbbed with a deep, sickening pain. Her hands and feet were bound with what felt like zip ties, the plastic cutting into her wrists and ankles, and she was lying on a hard surface, concrete or stone, in a space that echoed slightly when she moved. Memory flooded back. The diary. Hammond's confession. The chase. The blow to her head. She was still in the museum basement, she realized, but not in the main vault. The air was different, mustier, older. Then she remembered something she'd read during her orientation when she first started working at Colonial Williamsburg. The museum building had been constructed in the 1980s on the site of several colonial-era structures. During construction, they discovered a network of old cellars beneath the site, remnants of 18th century buildings. Some had been preserved as archaeological features, accessible through a small door in the sub-basement level that was kept locked and rarely visited. Hammond had taken her to one of those old cellars. A place no one would think to look, where her screams wouldn't be heard through the thick colonial-era brick walls. Sarah forced herself to stay calm, to think logically despite the panic clawing at her chest. Hammond had left her here, which meant he needed time to do something, probably to dispose of the diary and create an alibi for himself. He couldn't kill her here, not directly. There would be too much forensic evidence. He would need to move her body, stage something that looked like an accident or make her disappear entirely, just as he'd done with Michael Torres and Jennifer Caldwell. But that meant she had time. Not much, but some. She worked at the zip ties binding her wrists, twisting and pulling despite the pain. The plastic bit deeper into her skin, and she felt warm blood trickle down her palms, but the bindings didn't loosen. Her ankles were similarly secured. She was trapped, immobile, in complete darkness in a sealed colonial cellar beneath a museum building. Think, Sarah. Think like a historian. Use what you know. She knew that colonial cellars were typically accessed through an external bulkhead or an internal hatch. If this was one of the preserved archaeological features, there had to be some kind of access point that allowed researchers or conservators to inspect the space. She also knew that old cellars like this were never completely sealed. There were gaps in the brickwork, ventilation shafts to prevent moisture buildup and mold growth. Sarah began to move, inch by inch, rolling across the cold floor. She couldn't walk with her ankles bound, but she could roll, and she could feel her way with her bound hands. The space was larger than she'd initially thought. After rolling several feet in one direction, she encountered a wall, rough brick, exactly as she'd expected. She followed the wall, rolling and pushing herself along, searching for any feature that might help her. Her fingers found a gap in the brick, a space where mortar had crumbled away. Cold air flowed through it, suggesting it connected to some kind of ventilation system. The gap was narrow, maybe 4 inches wide and 6 inches tall, far too small for her body, but potentially large enough for her voice to carry through. Sarah pressed her face against the gap and screamed, "Help! Someone help me! I'm trapped in the cellar below the museum." She screamed until her throat was raw, then listened. Nothing. No response. No footsteps above. Either the ventilation shaft didn't lead anywhere that people could hear, or the thick walls and floors of the building muffled her voice too much. She kept moving along the wall, and that's when her fingers touched something unexpected, a smooth, cold metal surface. She explored it carefully with her bound hands. It felt like a pipe, maybe 2 inches in diameter, running vertically along the wall. She traced it upward until her fingers found where it entered the brick ceiling. A drain pipe, probably installed in the 1980s during the museum construction to prevent water accumulation in the old cellar. An idea formed in Sarah's mind. If she could make noise through the pipe, if she could create vibrations or sounds that would travel through the plumbing system into other parts of the building, someone might hear. She twisted her body until she could position her head near the base of the pipe, then she began to scream into it, letting the metal amplify her voice. Between screams, she kicked at the pipe with her bound feet, creating a rhythmic banging that echoed through the darkness. How long she did this, she couldn't say. Time had become meaningless in the absolute darkness. Her voice grew hoarse. Her legs ached from kicking. But she kept going, driven by the terror of what would happen when Hammond returned. Then she heard it, a sound from somewhere above. A voice, distant and muffled, calling out. Sarah redoubled her efforts, screaming with what was left of her voice, kicking the pipe as hard as she could. The voice above grew louder, more distinct. Multiple voices now, she realized. Someone was coming. Light suddenly blazed in the darkness, blinding her. Sarah squeezed her eyes shut against the pain of it. She heard footsteps, exclamations, hands touching her carefully. "We've got her. She's alive. Get EMS down here now." The voice belonged to a Williamsburg police officer. As Sarah's eyes adjusted, she saw 3 uniformed officers and 2 paramedics crowding into the small cellar space. Someone was cutting the zip ties from her wrists and ankles. Someone else was wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. A female paramedic was shining a penlight in her eyes, asking her name, asking if she knew where she was. "Hammond," Sarah managed to croak out. "Robert Hammond. He killed Michael Torres and Jennifer Caldwell. He tried to kill me. You have to stop him." "We have him," one of the officers assured her. "He's in custody. Your friend Dr. Vance called us when you didn't answer your phone. She told us about the diary, about your suspicions. We came to the museum to talk to you, and your colleagues told us you'd had some kind of confrontation with Hammond, that you'd accused him of murder. When we couldn't find you, we searched the building." As they helped Sarah onto a stretcher and carried her up the narrow stairs from the colonial cellar, she learned what had happened during the hours she'd been unconscious. Patricia Chen, despite her initial confusion, had been troubled by Sarah's accusations and had called the Foundation's executive director. They'd checked the security footage, which showed Hammond following Sarah to the basement shortly after their confrontation. When Dr. Vance called the Williamsburg Police Department insisting they investigate Sarah's claims immediately, officers had arrived at the museum within 20 minutes. By the time they'd started their search, Hammond had already sealed Sarah in the colonial cellar and returned to his office, where he was calmly working at his computer as if nothing had happened. When questioned about Sarah's whereabouts, he'd claimed she'd left the building through a side exit after their confrontation. But the security footage contradicted his story, and when officers pressed him, small inconsistencies in his account began to emerge. The search of the museum basement had taken nearly 3 hours. The old colonial cellars weren't on any of the building's official floor plans, and several staff members had forgotten they even existed. It was Sarah's banging on the pipe that had finally alerted a maintenance worker on the ground floor to her location. The rhythmic metal sound had traveled through the plumbing system, creating an eerie noise that echoed through the building's water pipes. The worker had called the police officers searching the building, and they'd managed to trace the sound to its source. Sarah spent 2 days in Williamsburg Centara Hospital, treated for a concussion, dehydration, hypothermia from hours spent in the cold cellar, and the deep lacerations on her wrists and ankles from the zip ties. During that time, the Williamsburg Police Department and Virginia State Police launched a massive investigation into Robert Hammond's activities spanning nearly 4 decades. The diary that Sarah had found was indeed written by Jennifer Caldwell, who had worked as an archival assistant at Colonial Williamsburg from 1985 until her disappearance in March 1987. Jennifer's family had reported her missing 18 years earlier, but the case had gone cold almost immediately. Hammond had filed paperwork indicating Jennifer had resigned and moved out of state, and without any evidence of foul play, investigators at the time had simply classified her as a voluntary missing person. Michael Torres's disappearance had followed a similar pattern. His family in California had filed a missing person report when he failed to return home for a planned visit, but Virginia authorities had accepted Hammond's explanation that Torres had quit without notice. Torres's car, found in the employee parking lot, had been processed for evidence but yielded nothing suspicious. Without a body or any indication of violence, and with Hammond's authoritative assertion that Torres had simply left, the case had stalled. But now, with Hammond in custody and facing charges of attempted murder for his attack on Sarah, investigators began to dig deeper. They obtained search warrants for Hammond's home, office, vehicles, and financial records. What they found was staggering. In Hammond's basement, concealed behind a false wall in a storage area, investigators discovered a climate-controlled room containing dozens of colonial-era artifacts stolen from the Colonial Williamsburg collection over the past 37 years. The items ranged from small pieces like silver buckles and ceramic buttons to major pieces including a complete set of 18th-century furniture and several original documents signed by founding fathers. Conservative estimates placed the value of the stolen collection at over $3 million. Financial records revealed that Hammond had indeed been selling artifacts through a network of private collectors and unscrupulous auction houses, primarily operating through intermediaries in Europe where provenance requirements were less stringent. The sales had begun in the mid-1980s, just as Hammond claimed in his confession to Sarah, initially to cover his wife's medical expenses. But they'd continued long after that initial financial crisis had passed, becoming a lucrative side income that had allowed Hammond to live far beyond what his museum salary would support. Bank records showed regular deposits from shell companies that traced back to art dealers in London, Paris, and Amsterdam. Over 37 years, Hammond had embezzled an estimated $4.5 million through artifact theft and fraudulent sales. He'd used the money to purchase rental properties, invest in stocks, pay for his children's expensive private school educations, and maintain a lifestyle of quiet prosperity that his colleagues had attributed to family wealth. But the most significant discovery came when investigators began searching the grounds of Colonial Williamsburg for evidence related to Michael Torres and Jennifer Caldwell. Using ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs, they focused on areas that Hammond would have had access to and that had remained undisturbed since the 1980s. On the fourth day of the search, dogs alerted to an area behind the Peyton Randolph House, a historic building that had undergone extensive renovation in 1987. Excavation revealed human remains buried approximately 4 feet below the surface in an area that had been landscaped during the 1987 renovation, a project that Hammond, as director of museum operations at the time, had personally overseen. Dental records confirmed the remains belonged to Michael Torres. The cause of death was blunt force trauma to the skull, consistent with being struck by a heavy object. Forensic analysis suggested Torres had been killed elsewhere and his body transported to the burial site, probably during the nighttime hours when the historic area was closed to visitors. The search continued, and 3 days later, a second set of remains was discovered in a wooded area near the Colonial Parkway, about 2 miles from the museum. These were identified as Jennifer Caldwell. She had also died from blunt force trauma, though her injuries suggested a more violent struggle than Torres had experienced. Forensic pathologists theorized that Jennifer had fought back against her attacker, resulting in defensive wounds on her hands and arms before the fatal blow. The discoveries sent shockwaves through Colonial Williamsburg and the broader museum community. Robert Hammond had been a respected figure for nearly 4 decades, serving on boards of professional organizations, mentoring young curators, publishing scholarly articles on colonial material culture. He had given hundreds of public lectures, appeared in documentaries about American history, and been quoted in major newspapers as an expert on colonial-era artifacts. The revelation that he was not only a thief but a double murderer shattered the institution's reputation and prompted a complete review of security protocols and oversight procedures. For Sarah Mitchell, the aftermath was complicated. She was hailed as a hero by many for exposing Hammond's crimes, but she struggled with the trauma of what she'd endured. The hours spent bound and alone in that dark cellar, not knowing if she would live or die, left psychological scars that didn't heal as quickly as her physical injuries. She took a leave of absence from her position at Colonial Williamsburg, unable to walk through the museum building without experiencing panic attacks. Dr. Eleanor Vance, Sarah's former advisor, became her advocate during this difficult period. She connected Sarah with a therapist who specialized in trauma recovery and helped her navigate the complex process of testifying against Hammond. She also quietly worked behind the scenes to ensure Sarah received recognition for her role in solving 2 decades-old murders and recovering millions of dollars in stolen artifacts. The legal proceedings against Robert Hammond began in the fall of 2005. He was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of attempted murder, multiple counts of theft and embezzlement, and fraud. Despite his initial attempts to claim that Sarah's accusations were false and that the confrontation in the museum had been a misunderstanding, the evidence against him was overwhelming. The diary, along with Sarah's photographs of its pages, proved that Jennifer Caldwell had documented Hammond's theft scheme and his threats against her. The discovery of both bodies corroborated the diary's claims that Hammond had killed to protect his secret. Security footage from the museum showed Hammond assaulting Sarah and dragging her into the basement. Financial records demonstrated decades of systematic theft and money laundering. And perhaps most damning, forensic evidence from Hammond's home included traces of blood in his basement that DNA analysis matched to Michael Torres. Hammond's attorney attempted to negotiate a plea deal, but prosecutors, under intense public pressure, refused. The case went to trial in March 2006, exactly 1 year after Sarah's abduction. The trial lasted 6 weeks and was covered extensively by local and national media. Court TV aired significant portions of the proceedings, and major newspapers assigned reporters to cover the story daily. Sarah testified for 3 days, recounting her discovery of the diary, her research into Michael Torres's disappearance, and the terrifying hours she'd spent trapped in the Colonial cellar. Her testimony was compelling and emotional, particularly when she described hearing Hammond's confession and realizing she was in the presence of a man who had killed twice before and would kill again to protect his secret. Hammond himself chose not to testify, a decision his attorney made to avoid the prosecution's cross-examination. But his silence couldn't prevent the mountain of evidence from speaking for him. On April 14, 2006, after deliberating for less than 8 hours, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all counts. At his sentencing hearing 2 weeks later, Judge Margaret Thornton delivered a scathing rebuke before handing down the maximum penalty allowed under Virginia law. "You were entrusted with preserving history," she told Hammond, who stood before her in an orange jumpsuit, a dramatic change from the distinguished professor who had commanded respect for decades. "Instead, you destroyed it. You stole artifacts that belonged to the American people. You murdered 2 young people whose only crime was being conscientious enough to question your actions. And you would have killed a 3rd if she hadn't had the courage and intelligence to fight back." Judge Thornton sentenced Hammond to 2 consecutive life terms without possibility of parole for the murders of Michael Torres and Jennifer Caldwell, plus an additional 40 years for the attempted murder of Sarah Mitchell and the theft charges. At 64 years old, Hammond would spend the rest of his life in a Virginia state prison, a precipitous fall from the heights of academic prestige he had once enjoyed. The families of Michael Torres and Jennifer Caldwell, who had lived with unanswered questions for 18 years, finally had closure. Michael's sister, Elena Torres, spoke to reporters after the sentencing, tears streaming down her face. "We knew Michael would never have just walked away from his life," she said. "For 18 years, people told us to accept that he'd moved on, started over somewhere else. But we knew our brother. We knew something terrible had happened. Today, finally, we have answers. It doesn't bring Michael back, but it means his death has meaning. His name has been cleared. And the person responsible will never hurt anyone else." Jennifer Caldwell's elderly parents, who had never stopped searching for their daughter, released a statement through their attorney. "Jennifer died trying to do the right thing. She saw corruption and theft, and she refused to stay silent even when threatened. That was who our daughter was, brave, principled, and unwilling to compromise her integrity. We are heartbroken that her courage cost her life, but we are proud of the woman she was. We hope her story will inspire others to speak up when they witness wrongdoing, and we pray that Sarah Mitchell, who finished what Jennifer started, will heal from this trauma and know that she has our eternal gratitude. The Colonial Williamsburg Foundation faced significant fallout from the scandal. The Foundation's board of directors commissioned an independent investigation into how Hammond had managed to steal artifacts and commit murder without detection for nearly 4 decades. The resulting report was damning, revealing systemic failures in inventory management, inadequate oversight of senior staff, and a culture that prioritized institutional reputation over accountability. The Foundation implemented sweeping reforms. They created a new position of Inspector General to provide independent oversight of operations. They installed comprehensive security systems throughout all buildings, including cameras in previously unmonitored areas like basement storage spaces. They completely overhauled the artifact inventory system, implementing RFID tracking for every item in the collection. And perhaps most significantly, they established anonymous reporting channels for employees to raise concerns about theft, fraud, or other misconduct without fear of retaliation. The Foundation also created the Jennifer Caldwell Memorial Fund for Archival Ethics, providing grants to archival and museum professionals who demonstrated exceptional integrity in protecting cultural heritage. The first recipient of the fund was Sarah Mitchell, who received a $50,000 grant to support her continued research and recovery. For Sarah, the road back to normalcy was long. She spent months in therapy, working through the trauma of her abduction and the complex guilt she felt about having put herself in danger. Dr. Vance helped her understand that her actions, while risky, had been motivated by a commitment to truth and justice, the same commitment that had driven Jennifer Caldwell. Slowly, Sarah began to rebuild her life. She returned to work at Colonial Williamsburg in early 2007, though in a different role. The Foundation created a new position for her as Director of Historical Integrity, with a mandate to ensure that the institution's commitment to preserving history extended to confronting uncomfortable truths about its own past. In this role, Sarah led projects to document the full history of the Torres and Caldwell murders, ensuring that future generations would know what had happened and why institutional accountability mattered. She also completed the research project that had led her to discover Jennifer's diary in the first place. Her study of colonial-era land ownership patterns and the economic structures that supported slavery was published in 2008 by the University of Virginia Press. The book, titled Foundations Built on Suffering, Property, Power, and Enslavement in Colonial Virginia, won several awards and established Sarah as a leading voice in public history. In the acknowledgments section, Sarah wrote, "This book would not exist without Jennifer Caldwell, who paid the ultimate price for her commitment to truth." Her diary, hidden for 18 years, became a beacon that led to justice. I hope this work honors her memory and the memory of Michael Torres, both of whom believed that history matters and that institutions must be held accountable for their actions. The most unexpected development in the aftermath of Hammond's conviction came in 2009, 4 years after Sarah's abduction. A retired detective named Thomas Brennan, who had worked on the original Michael Torres missing person case in 1987, contacted Sarah through the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. Brennan was dying of cancer and wanted to make a confession of his own. They met in Brennan's hospice room, a small, sterile space that smelled of antiseptic and wilted flowers. The former detective, his body ravaged by illness, looked nothing like the robust officer Sarah had seen in old case file photographs. But his mind was clear, and what he told her changed Sarah's understanding of everything that had happened. "I knew," Brennan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not everything, but enough. When Torres went missing, I investigated. I interviewed Hammond, and something about his story didn't sit right. The way he described Torres just leaving, abandoning his car, it didn't make sense. I went back to question him again, without backup, without telling my supervisor. I wanted to be the hero who solved the case." He paused, struggling to breathe. Sarah sat in silence, her heart pounding, sensing what was coming. "Hammond knew I suspected him," Brennan continued. "He offered me money. A lot of money. $50,000 to close the case, mark Torres as a voluntary missing person, and move on. I was going through a divorce. My ex-wife was taking everything. I had 2 kids in college. I told myself that there was no body, no evidence, no way to prove anything. I told myself that Torres was probably dead anyway, that taking the money wouldn't change that. So I took it. Tears rolled down the old detective's weathered face. I've lived with that decision for 22 years. I've watched Hammond get promoted, get honored, live a good life, knowing that I helped him get away with murder. When you exposed him, when the bodies were found, I wanted to come forward. But I was a coward. I stayed silent. Now I'm dying, and I can't take this to my grave. You deserve to know the truth. Jennifer Caldwell and Michael Torres deserved better than me. Sarah sat with Brennan for another hour, listening as he provided details about his investigation and Hammond's payoff. She recorded everything with his permission, knowing that this confession, even from a dying man, had legal implications. After leaving the hospice, she went directly to the Virginia State Police. Brennan died 3 weeks later. Before his death, he provided a sworn affidavit detailing his misconduct and Hammond's bribery. The revelation prompted a new investigation into corruption within the Williamsburg Police Department and led to a review of dozens of cold cases from the 1980s and 1990s. While Brennan couldn't be prosecuted due to his death, his confession resulted in policy changes regarding how missing person cases were investigated and documented. For Hammond, still serving his life sentence at the Red Onion State Prison in Southwest Virginia, Brennan's confession meant additional charges. In 2010, he was convicted of bribing a law enforcement officer and obstruction of justice, adding another 20 years to his sentence, a symbolic addition given that he was already serving multiple life terms. But for Sarah, Brennan's confession was more than just another legal development. It reinforced something she'd come to understand through her ordeal: that institutions are only as strong as the individuals within them, and that silence in the face of wrongdoing is itself a form of corruption. Brennan's choice to take a bribe, to look the other way, had enabled Hammond to kill Jennifer Caldwell. If Brennan had done his job properly in 1987, Jennifer would likely still be alive. Sarah used Brennan's story as a teaching tool in presentations she gave to museum professionals, law enforcement officers, and ethics students. She spoke about the cascading consequences of moral compromise, about how one person's decision to prioritize personal comfort over duty could cost others their lives. Her talks were popular and powerful, often leaving audiences in tears. By 2015, 10 years after her abduction, Sarah had become a nationally recognized advocate for transparency and accountability in cultural institutions. She served on advisory boards for several major museums, consulted with law enforcement agencies on artifact theft cases, and taught graduate seminars on ethics in public history at the College of William and Mary, her alma mater. She had also written a memoir about her experience, titled The Diary in the Archives: Truth, Theft, and Terror at Colonial Williamsburg. The book became a bestseller, appealing to both true crime readers and those interested in museum ethics. Sarah donated all proceeds to organizations supporting families of murder victims and to scholarship funds for students pursuing careers in museum work and archival science. Despite her professional success, Sarah remained deeply affected by what she'd endured. She never married, telling friends that the trauma of her abduction had made it difficult for her to trust people deeply. She lived alone in a small house in Williamsburg, just a few miles from the museum where it had all happened. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, she would walk through the historic district, past the carefully preserved colonial buildings, and think about Jennifer Caldwell, about Michael Torres, about all the young people who had worked at Colonial Williamsburg over the years with dreams of preserving history, never imagining that history could turn deadly. In 2018, on the 13th anniversary of her abduction, Sarah received an unexpected package in the mail. Inside was a letter from Robert Hammond, mailed from Red Onion State Prison. Sarah's hands trembled as she opened it, unsure what to expect. The letter was handwritten, Hammond's once confident script now shaky with age. Dear Dr. Mitchell, I know I have no right to contact you. I know that my actions caused you immeasurable pain and trauma, and that no words I write can undo what I did. But I am writing to you anyway, because there are things you should know. For 13 years, I have lived in a cell, alone with my thoughts and my guilt. I have had a great deal of time to reflect on what I did and why I did it. I wish I could tell you that I was driven by desperation, that I was protecting my family, that circumstances forced my hand. But the truth is simpler and more damning. I was driven by pride, by greed, and by an arrogant belief that I was too important to be held accountable for my actions. When Michael Torres discovered my theft, my first instinct wasn't to confess or to make things right. It was to eliminate the threat he posed to my reputation. I killed him in a moment of rage, and then I spent the next 18 years justifying that decision to myself, telling myself that I'd had no choice, that he'd forced my hand by threatening to expose me. The same with Jennifer Caldwell. The same with you. But you didn't let me get away with it. You refused to be erased, refused to be another forgotten victim. You fought back, and you exposed not just my crimes but the institutional failures that enabled them. For that, I am grateful, though I have no right to your gratitude in return. I'm writing this letter because I am dying. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4. The doctors say I have perhaps 3 months. I will die in this prison, which is exactly what I deserve. Before I die, I wanted you to know that your courage, your refusal to stay silent, saved lives. After my conviction, forensic accountants traced my network of collectors and dealers. That investigation led to the recovery of stolen artifacts from museums across the United States, and to the prosecution of dozens of people involved in the illegal antiquities trade. Objects that had been stolen and lost for decades were returned to their rightful institutions. History that I tried to erase has been recovered. More importantly, the reforms that Colonial Williamsburg and other institutions implemented because of what happened, the oversight systems, the reporting channels, the ethics training, those changes have prevented others from following the path I took. I know of at least 3 cases where theft was detected and stopped early because employees felt empowered to report suspicious activity without fear of retaliation. That wouldn't have happened without you. I don't ask for your forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I wanted you to know that something good came from the terrible things I did, and that good exists because of you. Robert Hammond. Sarah read the letter 3 times, her emotions a complicated tangle of anger, sadness, and something that might have been pity. She never responded to Hammond. She didn't attend his funeral when he died 4 months later in the prison infirmary. But she kept the letter, filing it with the other documents from the case that she maintained in a secure file in her home office. In 2023, 18 years after her abduction, Sarah was approached by a documentary filmmaker who wanted to tell the full story of the Hammond case. After much consideration, Sarah agreed, on the condition that the documentary focus not on her own experience but on Jennifer Caldwell and Michael Torres, the 2 people who hadn't survived their encounters with Robert Hammond. The documentary, titled The Curator's Confession, premiered at the Tribeca Film Festival and was later acquired by a major streaming platform. It featured interviews with the Torres and Caldwell families, with law enforcement officials who had worked the case, with museum professionals who had known Hammond, and with Sarah herself, who spoke on camera for the first time about the hours she'd spent trapped in that colonial cellar, convinced she was going to die. The documentary ended with footage of Colonial Williamsburg as it exists today, still beautiful, still carefully preserved, still welcoming millions of tourists each year. But now, embedded in that preservation, is an acknowledgement of the institution's painful history. A small memorial plaque stands near the Peyton Randolph House, where Michael Torres's body was found. It reads, "In memory of Michael Torres, 1957 to 1987, and Jennifer Caldwell, 1963 to 1987, who died in service of truth and integrity. Their courage reminds us that preserving history means confronting uncomfortable truths about the past and holding institutions accountable in the present." Every year on March 14th, the anniversary of Sarah's abduction and the discovery of Jennifer's diary, Colonial Williamsburg holds a memorial service. Museum staff, researchers, students, and members of the public gather to remember Torres and Caldwell, to recommit to the principles of transparency and accountability, and to honor those who speak up against wrongdoing even when it's dangerous to do so. Sarah always attends. She stands quietly in the crowd, listening to the speeches, watching as Colonial Williamsburg's current leadership reaffirms its commitment to ethical practices. And every year, after the service, she walks alone to the museum building, down to the basement level, past the main vault where she first discovered the diary, to the small door that leads to the old colonial cellars. She doesn't go inside. She simply stands there for a moment, remembering. remembering the terror of being trapped in absolute darkness, remembering the determination that kept her fighting, kept her making noise through that pipe, kept her alive long enough for rescuers to find her. Remembering Jennifer Caldwell's words in the diary, "Someone needs to know the truth." The truth is known now. 2 young people died for it. Sarah nearly joined them. But because she survived, because she refused to stay silent, their deaths meant something. The system changed. Institutions became more accountable. And somewhere, Sarah hopes, in archives and museums across America, other would-be whistleblowers take courage from Jennifer's and Michael's examples, knowing that speaking truth to power, while dangerous, is not futile. As Sarah walks back through the historic district, past tourists photographing colonial facades and children playing on greens, she thinks about what history really means. It's not just the carefully preserved buildings and authenticated artifacts. It's the messy, complicated, sometimes brutal truth about human nature, about greed and courage, corruption and integrity, silence and testimony. Colonial Williamsburg still tells the story of America's revolutionary past. But now it also tells a different story, a harder story, about the price of truth and the ongoing struggle for accountability. And that story, Sarah believes, is just as important as any tale of founding fathers and colonial courage. Because in the end, history isn't something that happened long ago. It's happening now, every day, in every choice we make about whether to speak up or stay silent, whether to confront wrongdoing or look the other way. Jennifer Caldwell and Michael Torres chose to speak up. They paid for that choice with their lives. But their voices, preserved in a diary hidden in an archive, eventually became loud enough to be heard. And sometimes, Sarah thinks as she watches the sun set over the colonial rooftops, that's all any of us can hope for, that our voices will be heard, that our truths will matter, that our choices will make a difference, even if we're not around to see the outcome. The diary in the archives changed everything. And 18 years later, its echoes still resound through the cobblestone streets of Colonial Williamsburg, a reminder that the past is never truly past, and that justice, while sometimes delayed, can still arrive. If this story moved you, please subscribe to stay updated on more true crime cases. Remember, every case we cover represents real people and real families affected by tragedy. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.